This week on The Sceptic, I speak to Chris Bayliss, independent consultant and writer, on the interesting police response to the Liverpool car incident this week and the scandal of Commonwealth voting in UK elections.
Most countries around the world, including the Commonwealth, want people to be citizens before they allow them to vote. And yet it's a very strange hangover, the fact that any Commonwealth national legally resident or present in the UK with an address can vote in all of our elections, including general elections.
Sarah Phillimore, barrister and gender-critical campaigner, on how the Bar Standards Board has been forced to scrap its nightmarish diversity guidelines for lawyers.
My guess is a staggering number of King's Counsel told them in no uncertain terms that this was an utter disaster. And I suspect it's not because they have seen the error of their ways. I think they've just realised, certainly at this time, it will be impossible because of the degree of really visceral reaction against it and the practical impossibilities of enforcing it.
And for our premium subscribers, I speak to Eugyppius, Substacker and The Sceptic's Germany correspondent, on the authoritarian attempts to ban the AfD, the pensioner jailed for a 3-word slogan, and the truth behind claims of white genocide in South Africa.
It's not that difficult to show that the murder rates of Boer farmers seems to be significantly higher, maybe twice the ambient murder rate. It's pretty obvious that there's a racial political targeting of Boer farmers in South Africa.
Hello and welcome to episode 38 of The Sceptic, the Daily Sceptic's weekly podcast. I'm your host, Laurie Wastell, an associate editor at the Daily Sceptic. Now, how many people are eligible to vote in British elections? Ask the man on the street and he'll probably tell you, well, the adult population of the UK, which is about 40 million. But in fact, the real figure is some 1.8 billion, thanks to a bizarre loophole by which Commonwealth citizens are technically eligible to vote in our elections. Now, just why is that? And how much of a problem is it? Well, to discuss that, I'm very pleased to be joined by Chris Bayliss, who is an independent consultant and a writer for publications including The Critic. Welcome to The Sceptic, Chris.
Good afternoon. How are you doing?
Yeah, good to have you here.
Good to be on.
Okay, so Chris, how did we get into this bizarre situation where everyone in the Commonwealth is able to vote in UK elections?
Well, yes, I think a lot of people, including probably quite a lot of Commonwealth citizens themselves, would be very surprised to discover that in theory they have this right. In practice, of course, it only extends to Commonwealth nationals who are legally resident in the UK, which is to say that they are present here and living in the country with an address that isn't a hotel, and that they are on a valid visa, which is enormously more generous than almost any other Commonwealth country, applies reciprocally. Australia doesn't do it at all, other than for people who were registered prior to the 1984 change of the legislation in terms of the British Nationality Act that existed before that. Canada, you have to be a citizen to vote. New Zealand is the most generous in terms of anybody who has a resident permit and permanent resident status can vote after 1 year in the country. And that isn't Commonwealth, that's anybody, but they have to have settled status in the country, which is a lot more stringent than we are for Commonwealth nationals. And there are a couple of other examples of countries in the Commonwealth that have, after a number of years, I think Malawi lets people, any foreign citizen who has been resident in Malawi for more than 7 years vote. There are a couple of other examples. But other than that, most countries around the world, including the Commonwealth, want people to be citizens before they allow them to vote. And yet it's a very strange hangover, the fact that any Commonwealth national legally resident or present in the UK with an address can vote in all of our elections, including general elections.
Yeah, and so you spoke about the dominions there, but just remind us of the many, many other countries that are also in the Commonwealth, because, I mean, it's a huge block, isn't it?
I forget the total number of countries in the Commonwealth. It's several dozen, including quite a number of countries in East Africa, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, South Africa. You've got in West Africa, you've got Nigeria, Ghana, the Gambia. As well in Africa, you've got several countries that were never part historically of the British Empire that have joined, such as Rwanda, Mozambique, Gabon joined a few years ago, so they can all vote. On top of that, you've got a number of countries in the Middle East and South Asia. So, of course, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. You've got a number of countries in the Pacific area. So, obviously, Australia and New Zealand, but you've also got a lot of those Pacific island countries like Fiji and the Solomon Islands and places like that. And then, of course, you've also got the Caribbean nations, which are in the Commonwealth. But in terms of the numbers of people that are eligible and present in the UK and who don't enjoy British citizenship, the overwhelming majority of those are accounted for by India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and now Nigeria.
Right. And so, of course, in some respects, this is just an administrative loophole, right? It's just a right that is held in theory. But, of course, as you mentioned, that's not only the case. There is a material impact of it. Would you say it's a problem?
Well, I think historically it's never really been seen as much of a problem by anybody. Firstly, the numbers involved were always relatively low in the earliest days of immigration. Most of these people would have been under the terms of the 1948 British Nationality Act. They were all British nationals. Then, after those countries started to become independent, you had inflows of people, but they weren't enormous, and they tended to be concentrated in a few cities. And a lot of those people, to the extent that they voted, were Labour voters just piling up in places that were already safe Labour seats. So it didn't really have much of a dynamic, and certainly the Conservatives weren't too worried about it. And the Conservatives have always had a bit of a soft spot for the Commonwealth for historical reasons. Then in more recent years, certainly from the 1990s and the 2000s and up until 2016, you'd got a lot of the focus on immigration was people coming from Europe. And European EU nationals had the right to vote in local elections under the terms of EU rules, but not in national elections. The exceptions, of course, are people from either Ireland, who, under separate agreements we've got in Ireland to do with the status of Northern Ireland, they have the right, separate from the Commonwealth, to vote in British elections in all of them. And of course, nowadays you've got two Commonwealth member states in the EU, which are Malta and Cyprus. But that tended to be most of the focus about it and most of the political focus until 2016. By that point, the Conservatives, since the sort of the height of the New Labour era, had been concerned with their image as sort of being rather old-fashioned and a bit reactionary, and they wouldn't have wanted to have started talking about taking the right to vote off Commonwealth citizens. Firstly, because it would have gone against what David Cameron had been trying to do, making the party look nicer. And Theresa May, of course, in the same bucket there. And secondly, after 2010, once they were in power, they weren't looking to draw attention to the number of people coming in, either from the Commonwealth or not. So they wouldn't have wanted to have made a fuss about it. And as I said, it didn't really affect them too much. These by and large, weren't people who were costing the Tories marginal seats. It tended to be a piling up of Labour seats. Which is why nobody's paid it too much mind. And secondly, there's the issue that I think just an awful lot of people aren't aware about it at all. The question really of the status of Commonwealth citizens was settled as far as elections are concerned by the 1948 British Nationality Act, and then the night they were included, that right to vote was affirmed in the 1983 Representation of the People Act. So acts of parliament that are in both cases a long time ago, and that have really been forgotten about. And I think it's only now that this question's starting to come out into the open, really because of the numbers of people that have been arriving from outside of Europe over the last, well, especially the last 5 or 6 years, but over the last 10 or 15 years as well. And we're starting to see some unusual dynamics playing out in areas where there are a lot of Commonwealth voters. And that's starting to become more of an issue for Labour than it ever has been historically.
Yes, and let's definitely get into that political dynamic in a second. But I suppose more broadly, of course, there is this question here of how we are defining our national identity, and should this be open to basically a quarter of the Earth's population? Is this a problem in terms of our ability to define our national identity as well as the electoral consequences?
Well, I think it's quite odd because you've got, I think in recent years, much has been made of the concept of citizenship, which historically really is, it's not a word that we really started using at all up until a few decades ago. We were subjects, not citizens, in Britain, and the word was only really introduced in the 1980s. And in recent years, and especially under New Labour, we got the government has tried to push this concept of citizenship, sort of along a traditional European idea of citizenship, a sort of French Enlightenment idea. And this idea that anybody with citizenship was just as British as anybody else, which included sort of people who'd been naturalised, who'd acquired citizenship later in life, having been born elsewhere or born here to foreign parents. And that voting is participating in the democratic life of the country, of which voting is the most fundamental part, was tied up with the concept of citizenship. Except we've got this historical anomaly and anachronism left over from a much earlier period where the concept of what it meant to be British was in some ways more fluid and in some ways more rooted in the ground and in ancestry, but wasn't properly defined until the 1948 Act, which said it was everybody who was a subject of the Crown. Just on the eve of a lot of these countries actually becoming independent and becoming republics. So I think this idea that there are a whole bunch of non-citizens who are allowed to vote, it's jarring in terms of hearing that at the same time as hearing people talk about the concept of people becoming British by gaining citizenship, and citizenship being the key metric. I think there's clearly an incoherence there.
And so in terms of the political effects of this then, of course, we've seen recently with a lot of sectarian voting in the north of England, this is having a particular impact on Labour, in fact. Just tell us a bit more about that.
So I think historically, Labour, to some extent, took the votes, ethnic minority votes, or visible ethnic minority votes, whether that was people with Caribbean ancestry or people with South Asian ancestry. Labour pretty much took a lot of those votes for granted, and the Conservatives just didn't really think about it too much. Although there has always been a bit of a link between the Indian merchant community and the Tories to do with Ted Heath and the Ugandan Asians. But by and large, ethnic minorities have tended to have been assumed as being pretty reliable Labour voters. I think there's been a few changes to that over the last 15 years or so, maybe the last 20 years, that have started challenging that. One is the rise of a more assertive, much more politically vocal and politically active corpus of Muslim voters. And I think this first emerged as a recognisable phenomenon during the War on Terror era, where a lot of Pakistani, Bangladeshi Muslim voters objected to Tony Blair's foreign policy and his policy of backing up the Bush administration and in going into Afghanistan and Iraq. And there was the rise of people like George Galloway's Respect movement, which was an alliance between old school communists and basically Islamic fundamentalists, which existed until it split along its blindingly obvious fault line. But you had other independent voices, and that started to become an issue for Labour in some of their safer seats, places in the north of England during that era. But then the wind kind of got taken out of those sails by first Tony Blair leaving office, and then Labour getting kicked out of government, and then particularly by Jeremy Corbyn becoming Labour leader and being unequivocally pro-Palestine and generally being seen as being pro-Muslim because of some of his foreign policy positions. And that drew a huge amount of that support back to Labour from particularly Pakistani, Bangladeshi voters. And you also had historically the case that whilst in some heavily Muslim communities in some areas, there was, you could see a sort of rallying around that identity. Nationally, the community, sort of the various communities that make up the bulk of Britain's Muslim population were too divided culturally, linguistically, and politically to form a sort of a coagulous Islamic party. So you've got, for example, in Tower Hamlets, you had Lutfur Rahman's movement, which is now Aspire, which is basically entirely ethnically Bengali. The Bengalis are only 35% of Tower Hamlets, but that is enough if the other communities are divided. So that there you've got an exclusively Bengali party, and then in Birmingham and in parts of Greater Manchester and Lancashire, you've got basically Pakistani Kashmiris. Now, you can't form a single united group out of that, but it's enough that you can really start challenging Labour in some of their core seats if you've got enough people there that are upset with Labour, which is what's happened now that Labour are backing government and actually being forced by the realities of being in power to take pragmatic positions that don't alienate the US, that don't alienate other European countries, which are interpreted by most Muslim voters, as far as they are concerned, unless you are absolutely 100% allied and take the Palestinian position and the Hamas position on everything. As far as they're concerned, you may as well be buying nukes for Israel, and that's how they interpret that. And really, it's an impossible line for a Labour government that's actually in office to walk. So that political movement is happening again. At the same time, notwithstanding those gripes among the Muslim community, you have got a lot of Indian, predominantly Hindu, but also Sikh voters that regard Labour as being the party of the Pakistanis and a pro-Muslim party just because of the demographics of a lot of those seats. And to be clear, notwithstanding Corbyn being out and Starmer being in, there are still plenty of voices within the Labour Party at a local level and in Parliament who are unambiguously pro-Palestine, anti-Israel, and would be generally expected to take the Pakistani position over an Indian position if it came down to it. But you've got a lot of those voters, and especially Hindu voters, who are starting to basically look to the Conservatives as being their natural political home. And the Conservatives, to some extent, or some Conservatives, have been playing up to that. People like Bob Blackman in Harrow East, and various politicians in parts of the sort of home counties where the Indian population's bigger, and famously Leicester. And I think these two phenomena that I've described here about Pakistani voters and Indian voters can be seen most clearly in Leicester, where you had, on a night that was otherwise a pretty much there was a triumph for Labour, you had the party losing 2 seats, one to an independent sectarian Muslim candidate, and the other to a Conservative who had cultivated the Hindu vote. Now, in both of these cases, these political trends are being driven by second or third generation Pakistani or Indian citizens of the UK who were born here and who have the right to vote because they are citizens. But because of the size of the wave of immigration from India, from Pakistan that we've seen over the last few years, and the fact that a lot of those arrivals will cluster in areas where there are already existing populations of their co-religionists or nationals, where they have cultural or family links, that those numbers of voters have been swollen by people who don't have British citizenship and who have the right to vote by virtue of being Commonwealth citizens. Now, normally, we wouldn't expect to see those people necessarily reliably turning out to vote because they might not be aware of their rights, they might not be particularly interested in British politics, they might not have a strong view either way. But where you've got concerted campaigns by political organisation, whether that's people like the Independent Alliance MPs who compete for the Pakistani vote, or whether that's pro-Indian Conservatives, those people will identify those new voters and rally them and get them out. And in terms of people who don't really have a strong view either way in politics, well, what's it to them? Why not turn out there and it's sort of part of being part of the community to some extent. So the arrival of that number of voters into some of those seats is a bigger headache for Labour than for anybody else. politically in terms of the dynamics of the party system. And so I think that's what's interesting in terms of how Starmer has pushed back this ILR, the 5-year indefinite leave to remain, which then opens you up once you've done your life in the UK test to becoming a British citizenship. That being pushed out to 10 years really changes the dynamic in terms of, is it worth his while campaigning on this subject? Because previously, obviously, if there's the 5-year indefinite leave to remain ILR pathway to becoming a citizen, it doesn't really. Is it really to your advantage to stop somebody voting in one election if they're going to be able to vote in the next election as a citizen? All you're going to do is alienate them. Why not try and win them over? But the change of ILR from 5 to 10 years really changes the dynamic there, especially if there's going to be further changes that actually stop a lot of new arrivals from becoming citizens at all.
And I suppose before we get to the question of how one might put this on the political agenda, because of course it's an issue, as you say, that not very many people are aware of, I suppose one might say that this is a conservative-minded issue. It's a migration-skeptical issue to put forward these restrictions. And so a cynical observer might say, well, if it's only impacting Labour, then who cares? What do you say to that?
Well, I say, by that metric, I've probably got a cynical mind. I think with this policy, I think it'd be relatively easy to put this on the political agenda. I think that an awful lot of people, including a lot of people who are straight down the middle on the subject of immigration and don't have strong views either way, I think people would find it very surprising that large numbers of non-citizens, no matter how long they've been in the country, even sort of somebody that, so long as they're in the country legally, somebody who's in the UK for a few months, could potentially vote in national elections. I think people will be very surprised about that, and I think people that sort of really wanted to come down hard on the other side and say, well, these people, why shouldn't they be able to? I think they'd have a very hard time defending that policy because it's just left over from a completely different time where we had a very different relationship with what had been until recently part of the British Empire, and which now are, to a far greater degree, even countries like Canada, are different independent countries with completely different political traditions. And I think that, well, I think that's what I think. All it would take is somebody to try and defend the policy, and the row that it would create would draw a lot of attention, and I think people would be very surprised. And I think that making the argument that it makes, because obviously Labour have got a huge clunking majority at the moment, if they thought for a moment that that restricting these rights to vote would damage their prospects at the next election, it's not going to happen. But I think that there's a case to be made that actually they're the people politically with the most to gain. Because some of these seats, and I don't know how salient the Palestine question, the Gaza question is going to be come 2029. But you can absolutely guarantee that Labour will have been able to alienate Muslim voters on a range of foreign policy subjects between now and then. It could be something to do with India. Obviously, we've recently seen Kashmir and India-Pakistan conflict there. It could be something in Africa. It could be something to do with Iran and the Middle East. There's all sorts of ways. Yemen. There's a variety of scenarios that could end up with Labour looking a little bit imperialist in the eyes of parts of the British Pakistani or British Bangladeshi community, and that's still going to be there. And some of these seats are going to be very tight indeed at the next election. I think that Labour strategists will probably be taking a look at this quite carefully, and they're obviously going to be nervous to sort of strike out and be the ones to say, actually, we're getting rid of Commonwealth voting. We're taking the right to vote off sort of probably, I guess, at least 2 million people currently in the country who can do so. It's difficult to tell exactly. I think a lot of voices within Labour would be nervous about bringing that up themselves. But I think if people outside the Labour Party and outside the left bring the question up, then I think it's something that they'll be at least open to considering. I mean, where did the decision to delay ILR? That came from outside of Labour. That came from people on the peripheries and on the centre right. And Actually, it got a lot of people in the Treasury nodding their heads, and it gave Keir Starmer an opportunity to do something really meaningful that demonstrated actually that he was serious about questions of immigration and citizenship and nationality.
Yes, and I'm interested in that pipeline really, because you and I know that this idea of reforming or extending the ILR threshold has been knocking around on the right for at least 6 months in earnest. In December I had Sam Bidwell on this podcast talking about it, for instance. He's been a big proponent of this. There's been several op-eds around then, and then by February it was taken up as Conservative Party policy, and now, this month it's become government policy. And so, that's quite interesting, isn't it? That, there's been this pipeline here, and because it's obviously not a very Labour-minded idea, and nevertheless it's been taken up really quite swiftly after having incubated not really that long ago.
I don't think there's a conspiracy here. I think that we've generally got a dearth of decent analysis and decent mainstream journalism in the centre, and especially on the centre-left. Those people aren't going to think of anything, and it's the issues to do with ILR, and it didn't take Sam Bidwell's a very intelligent guy, but it doesn't take a genius to say, oh look, all of these people have arrived, and then to tie that into the question of what their rights are going to be in 5 years, given the rules as they stand. But all it took was some intelligent people to write it down and to write a few articles, and it gets into the national agenda almost by default, because nobody else is really thinking or writing seriously about these kinds of things. So it's no great conspiracy or mystery. It's just people thinking about problems and writing it down, and a few people read it, and from there it gets traction. Obviously, because of social media and because of the lay of the internet and the way it works, that ideas can be introduced into the national debate. And there are some intelligent people hanging around the current government as spads or as advisors, and if they see an interesting idea, all it takes is a word in the right ear.
Yeah, not really saying it's a conspiracy, but that it's interesting that it's happened in this way. Okay, and so very briefly, what would it take legally to revoke this right? Would it be easy?
I'm no lawyer or constitutional expert, but you'd need, I think, just an amendment to the Representation of the People Act. I don't know whether the 1983 Act has been... I'm certain that the 1983 Act will have been updated in one way or another, but I think you just need to amend that Act. I don't think it would be terribly difficult.
Right, okay, and just to get your thoughts on one more thing while I have you. So, of course, on last night, on the day of recording this, there was this awful incident at the Liverpool Premier League Trophy Parade. And so a car collided with people in the crowd, as our viewers will know. Details are still a bit uncertain about what exactly happened there. But what was very notable was that within 2 hours of that happening, Merseyside police had disclosed the fact that the suspected driver was a white British male who was 53 years old from the Liverpool area. And even very swiftly after that, there was a press conference where we got quite a bit of information. And so this was, of course, in striking contrast to Merseyside Police's response to the Southport attack last summer, in which it took quite a long time, really, for any such identifying details to emerge about the attacker, and in particular about his ethnicity. In fact, it was only 4 days later that we saw the picture of him being featured on newspaper front pages. And so, well, you and I have spoken about the public response to the Southport attack, and the fact that even though Ruda Cabana is, of course, a British citizen, the fact that he was of a migration background is relevant here and is relevant to public feeling on the issue. What did you make of Merseyside Police being so swift to release the fact that the suspect last night was white?
Well, I think in the circumstances, it was the right thing to do. I think that people would have immediately have started to make people will very quickly have started speculating about the background of the attacker, and obviously the fact that it's a vehicle and a crowd of people. People are immediately going to be drawing assumptions and links to Magdeburg and the variety of other attacks that have looked like that. And they wanted to tamp it down straight away and say, no, this isn't that, this is something else. And they wanted to get rid of any speculation, well, particularly that the attacker might have been Muslim or might have been an immigrant, which is, under the circumstances, fair enough. The problem that they've got is that the reason you got this kind of speculation in the aftermath of Southport and any other attack like that, is that people have now got this sense that if the authorities don't mention the background of the assailant, they can quickly draw an assumption, well, A, that he isn't likely to be, or he or she isn't likely to be white, and B, at a guess, they're going to go balance of probabilities that they're going to start looking at the local Muslim community or Muslim communities, which actually, in terms of the type of attacks we've seen lately, is likely to be wrong. Very, very little of these kind of attacks have come from sort of settled second or third generation Pakistani communities in the way that the 7/7 era of attacks did. They tend to be people from a much more disparate kind of background and people who are much less committed to an ideology, as we discussed last time. But they're still going to have this issue that they saw how quickly the authorities confirmed that the man was white and British. And that's going to be a problem for them next time there is an attack and the perpetrator isn't white and British. What do? Do they come out straight away and say, actually, it's a person of second generation Rwandan background who was born in Wales and was raised a Christian? Or do they try and obfuscate, or do they go back to the strategy that they've been using over the last sort of decade or so of doing everything they can to draw attention away from the background of the attacker and onto the victims and their families and the trauma and the community? It's just another confirmation, really, I think, in a lot of people's eyes that if the attacker is white and British, they will say so straight away. And it was the right thing to do in this occasion. And particularly, I mean, I think things in Liverpool yesterday could have turned very hairy indeed, given that you've already got a crowd of people that are there, football supporters, emotions running high, and that could, with the size of the crowd, things could have turned very nasty indeed. And I completely understand why the authorities wanted to get a grip on the situation. But next time something happens, people are going to say very quickly, if they don't hear a confirmation from the authorities of what the suspect's background and motivations, not so much motivations, people will draw their own conclusions from that based on the details that are released about the background. If they don't come out with something pretty quickly, people will draw the conclusion that, well, it's not a white person.
Indeed, yes, that's very much the conclusion I've drawn. Okay, well, I think that's all we've got time for. Chris Bayliss, thank you very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for having me.
Now, my next guest is Sarah Phillimore, barrister and gender-critical campaigner. Last September, we had Sarah on The Sceptic to talk about some extraordinary proposals by the Bar Standards Board, which would force barristers to advance equality, diversity and inclusion in their work. Here's what she told us.
Are we going to be told, well, UKIP's horrid, they don't like diversity, they don't want to encourage immigration, for example, so you can't possibly represent somebody who is a member of UKIP because you're not advancing diversity, equality. Where is this going to end?
Well, I'm delighted to inform our audience that after a public backlash spearheaded by the Free Speech Union, this week the Bar Standards Board scrapped those dire woke proposals. So what changed? And what happens next? Well, I'm very pleased to be joined by Sarah Phillimore now to discuss that. Welcome back to The Sceptic, Sarah.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, good to have you here. So back in September, Sarah, you came on the podcast and really did elucidate for us what these proposals would have meant. So just remind us a bit about what was in them and why were they going to be such a problem?
Well, in September, I think you're right, September last year, it was announced that the Bar Standards Board were going to replace the existing Core Duty 8, which is simply a duty not to unlawfully discriminate, and replace it with a duty that told us we must act in a way that advances equality, diversity and inclusion. And this will apply to all barristers when practicing or otherwise when providing legal services. So I reacted, as you may recall, pretty immediately and quite in a shocked manner, because that to me read as if we risk being penalised for representing people who weren't very nice, who might themselves be said not to be advancing EDI. I was really, really troubled by that. There was then a meeting organised by the Free Speech Union around November time, where a very brave representative from the BSB came on to talk to what I accept was a largely hostile audience. So I hope we gave her tribute at the time to her bravery. She then said at that meeting, no, what the duty applies to is effectively administrative stuff, your recruitment and your retention processes. And as the barristers on the panel, I think it was Ken MacDonald and Akur Reindorf, said quite reasonably, well, why couldn't you say that? But even if this duty was restricted only to recruitment practices, and that's not how it's worded, then there's immediate and obvious problems, which I and many other people elaborated at great length upon. And of course, for me, the most fundamental difficulty was these words, equality, diversity, and inclusion, have no stable meaning. And indeed, there's great debate as to whether when you talk about equality, you're talking about equality of opportunity or equality of outcomes. And those are two very different things. And I think the primary objection is really that the BSB were attempting, it seemed, to impose its own view of what social justice was on a group of barristers. And obviously, as a gender critical campaigner in my spare time, I've been right at the sharp end of what happens to those of us who are deemed to have the incorrect views. We are excluded with great vigour and, as it turns out, quite unlawfully. So I'm really pleased to see today that the BSB have dropped these proposals. I think they would have been incredibly damaging and invidious. And I'm glad a very high proportion of really senior members of the profession spoke out loud about how troubled they were.
Yeah, really encouraging. And I suppose just to illustrate this a bit more, I mean, this is a political idea, this EDI stuff, and it would just go so flatly against that bedrock legal principle of equality before the law, and in particular the cab rank rule.
Well, you say political, but I'm worried there's something much worse going on here. I was at a meeting of the Westminster Legal Forum in February of this year, where we were discussing EDI in the legal profession. Interestingly, I think I was one of only 2 people to offer anything negative at all about EDI. The Director General of the Bar Standards Board was there, Mark Neal, and he was quite clear that he saw this as something which was moral. So this isn't just a political ideology, and I think this explains why we've got into so much difficulty with it. If its proponents think that what they're doing is moral, then if I disagree with them, we're not simply having a disagreement. I am myself an immoral person. And that, I think, explains the fever with which these initiatives have been pushed. I mean, the people pushing them really do see themselves on the right side of history. They are the resistance fighters in Nazi Germany. So, of course, they're going to strive very hard to push for what they believe is actually a moral imperative. So I think this is much more dangerous than a political ideology. This is something which people internalise. It's in their bones. And it renders them sadly incapable, I think, of any proper discussion about any weaknesses or flaws in that as a way forward. I mean, how can there be any? They are moral. They are right. And if I counter them, I therefore must be immoral. And I think this is a really dangerous place to have ended up in.
Yeah, and so with that feverishness, as you say, how has the BSB been made to change its mind?
My guess is because a staggering number of King's Counsel told them in no uncertain terms that this was an utter disaster. And they can barely cope with the amount of complaints they've got coming in at the moment. I, for example, had to wait. In March 2024, a complaint was made by a trans-identifying man that I brought the profession into disrepute by calling him a man. That was only resolved recently, and I suspect because I wrote an open letter to the Director General and published it on my Substack. And I said, look, this is ridiculous. Get on with it. So if they are in so much trouble over that kind of complaint, bringing in a duty which calls, remember, not just to support or promote, but to advance equality, diversity and inclusion, inevitably malicious actors are going to seize upon this and they're going to make complaints which don't have any foundation. I think the BSB would risk becoming completely overwhelmed.
Okay, and so take us through what's actually happened today. What has the BSB said?
Well, very little from what I can see. All I've got so far is the article in the Law Gazette, and it just says, we're very thank you for the thoughtful and measured high quality responses, and yes, we're not going to proceed with it. It's, certainly, well, I wouldn't expect in a short article for them to go into detail about the kind of issues that have been raised, because they are many and they are serious and they strike at the very heart of what we've just discussed about this being a moral position. So, there was no engagement with that, but I wouldn't necessarily expect it in a short article. I'm just very glad, for whatever reason, and I suspect it's not because they have seen the error of their ways. I think they've just realised, certainly at this time, it will be impossible because of the degree of really visceral reaction against it and the practical impossibilities of enforcing it. All these issues of proof, the fact I think complaints would simply multiply and it would become the focus of the BSB's very existence, which can't be right. So sanity has prevailed, but I don't know, and I'd like to find out to what extent that's due to a realistic appraisal of the sense of that proposal, or rather a pragmatic acceptance that they're just not going to be able to push it through.
Yes, exactly. So it seems they've resigned from it, but they haven't necessarily admitted that the ideas behind it were wrong. And so I think it's worth asking, can we be certain that there won't be another attempt to bring this in, perhaps by the back door?
Oh, if I'm right that this is being driven by a moral imperative, and I think I am because I've got it from the horse's mouth, of course it will come back. They can't give up if this is something that is morally righteous. Would you ask the French resistance to have just given up because they were having a tough day with the Nazis? No, you wouldn't. So, of course, this is going to come back. And I'm afraid, for me, I've had to learn the truth for the first time in my privileged life that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. I used to assume that those in positions of power and influence over me were there by virtue of their intelligence, reason, and authority. I don't think that anymore. And that's a very sad realization to have dawned on me as I hurtle towards old age. But it's always better to know. I'm very worried that this idea of some moral imperative, some idea of social justice that is attractive, it seems to only a very small minority of people, has become a stick which is used to beat us all. And that is actually to the detriment of a cohesive and safe society. So it's all dreadful.
I suppose also just in terms of the political environment in Britain in particular, I mean, you mentioned the campaigning of the Free Speech Union and there have been other gender-critical groups that have really been campaigning strongly on other things. And of course, we've recently had this win with the Supreme Court gender ruling. But I suppose, has that political pushback and activist campaigning, would you say that those voices are being raised in a way that they weren't a few years ago?
Again, I think this is just an illustration of how naive I have been. When I started getting involved in this 7 years ago, I thought all we needed were a few quick wins to bring everybody to their senses. And we had those. We had Harry Miller, we had Maya Forstater. And I thought, well, that's it. Surely everyone's going to wake up and see reason. They did not. We had to go all the way to the Supreme Court. And even now, all that judgment has done has revealed to me the true horror of what we've allowed to happen. The respect for the rule of law has been almost entirely destroyed in certain very important sectors of our society. There are respectable public organisations saying they will act in open defiance of the law. So that's where we are now. And unfortunately, I don't think we can rely on the Equality and Human Rights Commission to step into the breach because they've been starved of funding. I've recently made a complaint about training offered by Amnesty International, an intervener before the Supreme Court, remember. This isn't some sort of bogus whack job organisation. They offer online a training which directly and unlawfully discriminates against gender-critical women, effectively says, I am on a par with Andrew Tate. It's risible. It would be laughable if this wasn't being offered by somebody with the weight of Amnesty International. So I've made a complaint to the HRC about this, and I've been fobbed off and fobbed off. I've been told the problem is that I'm offended. I am offended, but that's not the problem. My offence is irrelevant. What Amnesty International are saying is unlawful, and they ought to know that it's unlawful. The training went online prior to the Supreme Court judgment, but I don't think it's been taken down or altered in any way. And I go back to my concern about this being an issue of morality. Of course, you don't obey immoral, bad laws. And that, I think, is exactly what has happened. I have been utterly naive. The rule of law has been compromised, and this is a really dangerous place to be. But I'm going to see today as just one tiny victory, snatching back a bit of respect for the rule of law, because that was primarily our objections. This is just unlawful. It is just unsustainable. EDI, these words have no stable definition. They can't be used to punish people. So, I don't want to sound too pessimistic. I think we are in a very parlous situation. But yeah, let's take the wins. And today, I think, was definitely a win.
Yes, and so in terms of those wins, obviously it happened last month, but the Supreme Court ruling there, how significant was that, do you feel? And I suppose, what was your reaction to it when it happened?
Well, I didn't think we were going to win. I mean, I'm so kicking myself. I had the day off. I could have gone down to London. I could have been jumping up and down and drinking champagne. My feeling was that they were going to be trapped by the Gender Recognition Act, which is clear that if you have a gender recognition certificate, your sex changes for all purposes unless there are recognised exceptions. And the obvious ones are sports and, for example, rape crisis centres. So I really didn't see how the Supreme Court could get around that. The best I thought we could hope for was the Supreme Court saying that this is a complete mess and Parliament needs to look at this and frankly needs to look at repealing or amending the Gender Recognition Act. They didn't do that. They were bloody brilliant. They effectively said the Gender Recognition Act cannot stand when it leads to absurd results. And if you tried to apply it in the Equality Act, in other words, to say that you have biological sex and something called certified sex, it leads to unworkable, unjust and absurd outcomes. So that is massive. And people are jumping up and down saying, oh, well, it doesn't apply to anything outside the Equality Act. Well, that's just very silly because the Supreme Court offered that general principle. If it's unworkable or absurd, the Gender Recognition Act can't apply. So it will apply to PACE. It is going to apply to issues of police officers searching women. It's got to, because to say that a woman has to agree to being searched by someone who is male, who is visibly male, who just happens to have a certificate to say he isn't, is obviously a gross absurdity and indignity and shouldn't be permitted. So I suspect there are going to be challenges on that basis. Oh, it was restricted to the Equality Act. But I can't see how people are going to get round that. Where it's obvious that the sex referred to means biological sex, then biological sex will prevail.
So, of course, these gender wars have been raging for many years on the trans issue. And there are certain constituencies in them, or certain partisans, who just take them really, really seriously and for whom the Supreme Court ruling was, of course, just this immense blow. And I think it's fair to say they don't really know how to deal with it. And so one of those in particular is a fellow by the name of Julian Moore. Now, perhaps you should introduce him to our viewers if they don't know him, but he is this activist lawyer, basically, and he's been waging this campaign, this bizarre campaign in the past month against J.K. Rowling in particular, and I know that you've been observing that a bit. Well, just tell us a bit about what's happening there.
It defies, sadly, belief, except it's happening, so I've got to believe it. The elephant in the room for Julian Moore is that I think he has 3 daughters and 2 of them now believe they are his sons. So he obviously has a great deal of skin in this game. It's going to be very difficult for him to ever admit that he did something wrong in supporting the transition of his own children. That's one element of it. The other element, of course, is he's clearly very capable and intelligent and very egocentric and narcissistic and doesn't want to be challenged. I go back to my point about morality. He is right. He is on the right side of history. So how dare anybody deny this? The combination of those factors are extremely toxic. And we are seeing that now play out. And it's becoming really uncomfortable to watch because he does seem to be very clearly now untethered from any ability to be rational about this. And his constant attacks at J.K. Rowling are, they started off as quite funny, but I think they're getting really disturbing now. And this is a woman who's just set up.
And just tell us about what some of those are.
It just seems to be constant. He's saying that she's acting because of her past trauma. She's a very unhappy person. It's unpleasant, these sorts of digs. And it does seem to be that he's very angry that here is a woman with her own money who's offering to fund legal actions for other women who've been unlawfully discriminated against, whereas he is asking us to give him our money. He's raised an astonishing amount of money, I think £500,000, to bring some completely bizarre and bonkers challenges to the Supreme Court. I think one of them, he's going to send the trans-identifying male judge, Victoria McLeod, to the European Court to complain that he wasn't allowed to intervene in the Supreme Court decision. Well, the the trans rights lobby group had an entire government and Amnesty International on their side. So I can't see how that is going to fly. But Jolyon Morn is asking a lot of really very vulnerable and frightened people who he's helped whip up into this state of vulnerability and fear to give him money. And I think it is now something that ought to be investigated. What he's doing is wrong. The personal jibes at J.K. Rowling and suggesting she's just acting out of unresolved trauma they're not merely undignified. For somebody in his position as a King's Counsel, I think it's high time the Bar Standards Board acted, but I doubt that they will, because of course they are aligned with Mr. Morn about what is on the right side of history, and his views, they would say, are. But I think what we're watching is deeply unpleasant and a really clear indication of how dangerous social media is for people who are becoming untethered from reality. It's a really, really dangerous stage for their breakdown to be played out to millions of people. And I've gone past the stage of sort of finding it funny, and I think it's really disturbing now.
And I suppose for Morn and for others like him who are really very much finding themselves on the losing side of the gender wars, is there any way they will crawl their way back to reality eventually? Or do you think they'll be more like that Japanese soldier on the island who kept fighting for years because no one ever told him that the war had already been lost?
I'm afraid I think it's the latter. And you look at what happened over the weekend, the self-proclaimed spokesman for this movement is a convicted criminal called Alan Baker, who's now out on licence, got a life term for various really serious criminal offences, parading naked from the waist up, shouting through a megaphone that named women, J.K. Rowling and Kelly J. Keane, should be afraid of him.
Kelly J. Keane, be afraid. He is not afraid. We are on the right side of history. Make no mistake.
Now, there's no rush to condemn this from the likes of Morn. This is what this movement is about. And that's why it's very clear to me it's about a men's sexual rights movement. And they've gathered up a number of very vulnerable teenage girls as ballast to this movement who want to escape their female bodies for reasons which are probably sadly only too obvious. So these are not a group of people who are going to want to find consensus. And there's an obvious consensus here. Of course, gender identity is important. I think gender identity should be protected, but you can't change sex. And you have to accept that in some circumstances, you are going to have to give way to people of the opposite sex, even if you really, really feel like you identify with them. I don't see why this is a problem. I don't see why this is immoral or on the wrong side of history. There ought to be a way forward, investigating safe unisex spaces, provision of third spaces, but we won't get it from a side which has as its spokesman a half-naked criminal who is again threatening women. I don't know if you remember a couple of years ago, he was charged with inciting violence after a massive public outcry when no action was taken. And the judge in that case just kind of sniggered and thought it was all very jolly funny. You know, he'd urged a baying crowd of 1,000 trans-identifying men to punch women in the face.
I was going to come here and be really fluffy and be really nice and say, yeah, be really lovely and queer and gay. No, if you see a turf, punch them in the fucking face.
These are not people who are going to compromise or negotiate. I'm afraid I think a lot of them are not well, and to give them this purported moral imperative is so dangerous, and it's got us into a real mess now. And of course the other issue is the police. We can't rely on the police to protect us. Things seem to be getting better, but I'll be very interested to see how the judicial review against Northumbria Police goes for being not impartial when it comes to supporting the rights of trans-identifying men. We've really lost a lot of public institutions. So and of course, a lot of people on my side are also reacting in quite an aggressive way, because we've had almost a decade of being treated really unfairly, and a lot of people have lost their reputation and their livelihood over this. So it's a very volatile situation, I think. There's not much will on either side to compromise, but I think Morn's side, there's no ability to. That's the problem. I'm quite confident that when my side gets a chance to catch its breath, what we're going to want to do is just move forward and stop wasting our time on this. We've all got so much better things we could be doing than arguing about whether or not biological sex exists. Of course it does, and it needs to be protected in law. Let's move on. I mean, I'm desperate to. It's getting really, really boring now to constantly having to keep banging the same drum. But we have to, because if we don't, women are going to be erased. Sex is going to be erased. And the consequences that flow from that are really serious.
Yes, and I just suppose finally, I know that case very well, the Sarah Bain Jacob trial where he was acquitted, but it was Tan-Ikram, the infamous Tan-Ikram, who handed down that judgment. And it's notable that in that judgment, he appeared to endorse the Trans Plus Pride March that was taking place that day, when he basically said that Baker was not calling for violence when he said this, but rather was seeking publicity for his cause, which is testament, I think, to just how sympathetic parts of our judiciary are and have been to these kinds of ideologies.
Yeah, my heart just absolutely sank. I mean, it is just such a gross misreading. I mean, Alan Baker threatened to come to an event that I was organising in Manchester in 2022, said he was going to come up and I was going to buy him dinner. I had to hire private security for that event. It's as if women just don't matter, as if these men can threaten us with impunity because they are doing so under the flag of moral virtue. We're not allowed to object. And this whole BSB, EDI, it's just another tentacle of this really insane octopus. So we have cut that tentacle off, but the head of the octopus remains. And I think it's going to be a long time before we actually succeed in cutting all its tentacles off, sadly.
Indeed. Well, let's hope it comes soon. Sarah Phillimore, thank you very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you very much.
Now, 3 months after its federal elections, what's going on in German politics? Have the Christian Democrats really taken an anti-migration turn? And why has the German state been trying to ban the right-wing populist AfD? Plus, what's the truth about claims of a white genocide against Afrikaner farmers in South Africa? Well, to discuss all that and more, I'm very pleased to be joined once again by the Sceptic's Germany correspondent, Eugyppius, who is the author of the Substack Eugyppius, A Plague Chronicle. Welcome to Sceptic, Eugyppius.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure, Mr. Wastell.
Yeah, good to have you back. Okay, so the last time I spoke to you was just after the German federal elections in February, and so the AfD had done about as expected at 20%, and Merz's parties, the Christian Democrats, had won with about 30%. And the question was what was going to happen in his coalition. And so you basically predicted that the CDU, if they went into coalition with the SPD, the Social Democrats, which it looked likely they were going to do, that they were going to bleed support quite rapidly to the AfD because they would be likely to water down their pledges on immigration. And now I haven't been following it as closely as you, of course, but that does seem to be very much what's happened over the past few months. So just tell us in a bit more detail, I suppose, how that's all played out.
Yeah, so it's true. What happened is because of the way the coalition dynamics work and the firewall, which the CDU, the Christian Democrats, ended up doubling down on.
That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, you'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you've become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate.